Her current work is focusing on healthcare pricing using a crowdsourced database of thousands of emergency room bills to tell stories about the cost of medical care in America today. At Vox, she also is the co-host of The Weeds, which is a policy podcast that she does with Ezra Klein and Matt Iglesias. And she also hosts and created The Impact, which is a podcast that explores how policy affects real people. At the beginning of the semester in my class, I always give my students a questionnaire that asks them a variety of things so I can get to know them better. What are their favorite books? What movies did they last see? And one of the things I ask them is what podcasts do they listen to? And The Weeds and The Impact were on virtually everyone's list this year, which is good. It's a wonderful way for me in particular to keep up with what the people I teach are doing. But they're a very discerning audience, so I highly recommend both podcasts. So Sarah has a very tricky topic today, but a fascinating one. She's going to give us her assessment of healthcare and the elections. So please join us in welcoming Sarah Kliff.
All right. Well, I'm going to try and move a little bit quickly since I think we're running a bit behind on our schedule. And, I also shy away from predictions a little bit these days because things are very unpredictable where I live in Washington. But I will do my best to kind of give you a sense of kind of where it seems like we're going in the 2018 midterms and then looking forward a little bit to the presidential election. So I have been covering health policy in Washington, D.C. since April 2010. So if you know your healthcare history, you know that's about 1 month after the Affordable Care Act passed. And I remember when I took that reporting job, a lot of my reporter friends were saying, why would you cover healthcare now? The legislative battle is over. It's going to be a boring beat. 8 years later, I have not had many boring days at my job. And, the reason for that is really because of the elections that we've had, particularly the 2016 election. Elections, if you take anything from the next half hour, it would be that elections matter an incredible amount of our health policy. And this upcoming election, both 2018, 2020, will matter a lot for health policy as well. Sorry, no one explained for me how to advance the slides. I know a lot about policy, but very little about technology. Clicker. There you go. All right, so healthcare elections matter a lot. And, there's no better proof of this, I think, than 2008 when we elected a Democratic president and also elected a supermajority in the Senate. Without all those elections happening across the country, we would not have had the Affordable Care Act. And each of those elections mattered. We're talking about right now really razor-thin margins. And, the 2016 election mattered, I don't have to tell this room, mattered a ton for healthcare. As we've talked about in previous talks, even though Obamacare wasn't repealed, and, it did get incredibly close. We're talking about, Senator John McCain's vote against the repeal bill sinking the effort. We're talking about a 1-vote margin. So things got very, very close. But there's still a very different management of federal healthcare programs. And, we've seen this talked about with these short-term insurance plans that are now sold on the market that seem likely to increase premiums for other folks, the decline in health insurance coverage that we've seen in some of the surveys that Dr. Summers and others are doing. And going forward, this lawsuit that was asked about earlier that is trying to overturn Obamacare's pre-existing conditions, you can expect the Trump administration is going to go about defending the Affordable Care Act in a much different way than the Obama administration would have, or than a Clinton administration or a Sanders administration would have. And, just to drive home how much this upcoming election in about a month matters, this was Vice President Pence talking to reporters about a month ago saying, that we made an effort to fully repeal and replace Obamacare, and we will continue. With Leah Vuckmer, she's the candidate in Indiana in the Senate, we will continue to go back to that. So, Obamacare repeal, so much health policy kind of rests on this election. So I'm going to talk about 3 things here. We're going to talk a little bit about the 2018 midterms, which will involve more talk about Medicare for all, since that kind of is the hot health policy topic in Washington right now. I also want to talk about some important 2018 ballot initiatives that largely relate to Medicaid expansion that I think are going to be really key to watch, and then look forward a little bit to the 2020 presidential election. But before we get to all that, as you heard from your my bio that my background's actually mostly in policy, that I'm definitely a policy nerd, and I think the policy kind of informs the politics that we're seeing right now. In my view, there's really two key trends that are shaping the 2018 midterms in terms of healthcare: rising prices and rising deductibles. So, as has been discussed in previous talks, we have really high healthcare spending. But just to get a little more granular on that for a second, it's not that we're all going to the doctor a ton. It's not that, it turns out we actually go to the doctor less than, our counterparts over in France or Canada, other developed countries. The reason that American healthcare spending is high is because our prices are incredibly high. Each time we go to the doctor, it is much, much more expensive. I pulled this chart from the International Federation of Healthcare Plans. They put out a report every 2 years that compares healthcare prices across the world. And this is the slide on the cost of an MRI. So we're talking about a pretty commodity good. And you just see that in the United States, it's head and tails above other peer countries, Switzerland, the UK, and Canada. $400, or Switzerland, UK, and Australia in this particular case. There are lots of charts in this report that look a lot like this chart. Usually the United States, with very few exceptions, is always that very tall bar on the left with the higher prices from everything from MRIs, appendectomies, knee replacements, drugs, you name it, we have high prices. So it's not just that our costs are high, it's that our prices are high. Our prices are high and they are rising very quickly. So this is from some of the work, that was mentioned earlier. I'm doing a lot of work on emergency room billing right now. Because I think, as was mentioned earlier, about 14% of American health spending is out of pocket at this point, and a lot of the woes of our healthcare system, are with people in those 14%, and some of those bills are ending up in the emergency room, which is where a lot of my reporting focuses right now. So this is a chart that is from a collaboration I did with the Healthcare Cost Institute, which is a big all-payers claim database. They get a lot of insurance bills from major insurance companies, group them all together, and are able to produce reports like this. And this shows the price of emergency room facility fees. These are the fees you pay for walking in the door and getting service, just the price of using an emergency room before any sort of services are provided. And the thing you see here, these are just the prices rising from 2009 to 2015. And the reason there's 5 codes gets a little wonky, but these have to do with the severity of different cases. But essentially, you see some of these fees are doubling in the span of 7 years. That is much, much faster than inflation. So you see, particularly for like a high severity emergency room visit, which would be the 99285 code, you see that basically doubling in 7 years. So, I think if you want to think about, well, why are people frustrated with the healthcare system? Why are they looking for, like some of the universal coverage proposals we've been talking about? It's about changes like this, about really steep rises and steep increases in fees. And just to, give you a few anecdotes from, the people who are living in this 14%, the people who are paying these bills. In the past years, I've been writing about emergency room bills. My most recent story was about a family who took their 1-year-old to the emergency room where the 1-year-old napped and drank formula. He had fallen off a hotel bed and bumped his head. It turns out because he had fallen off a hotel bed, the hospital activated their trauma team and met him at the emergency bay when he came in. He was coming in by ambulance because they were visiting from out of country. They didn't know what to do. They called 911. For the service, they now have an $18,000 outstanding bill for about an hour spent in the emergency room. I've written about a $14,444 bill for a rabies vaccine, where obviously there's not much elasticity around whether or not you're going to get a rabies vaccine. This was for someone who was bitten by a bat and then went to the emergency room, got this rabies vaccine. And, just to give you a frame of reference, in the UK, that same vaccine costs about $1,600. So just by virtue of getting it here, you get a pretty steep price increase. And then I also hear a lot from patients who are getting, big bills from out-of-network providers at in-network hospitals. So one I wrote about recently was a guy who woke up after being attacked in Austin, Texas, was unconscious, somehow gets to the hospital. And the first thing he does, because it's the United States, is he wakes up and he starts checking Cigna's website to figure out, is this hospital in my network? He thinks, okay, it is, I'm okay, goes about getting his medical care. It turns out the oral surgeon who works in this particular hospital's emergency room is not in network. So he ends up being balance billed for $8,000. oral surgeon is not especially sympathetic to his pleas to write this off until I wrote about his bill, and then all of a sudden, the bill disappeared. But I would say having journalists investigate individual healthcare bills is not a very good way to run a healthcare system, because there's only one of me, and there's a lot of these stories. So this is, one of the key trends I think that's driving healthcare politics right now is rising prices. The other thing is rising deductibles. So the rising prices wouldn't matter as much. They wouldn't have this political salience if people weren't being directly exposed to the prices. I think this is a really key chart from the Kaiser Family Foundation that shows, in the past decade or so, we've seen the number of Americans enrolled in high deductible plans or a deductible over $1,000 rise from 10% in 2006 to 46% in 2015. They actually just put out new data this morning that I was not able to get into my presentation, showing that deductibles in the United States are up 212% since 2006. In that same time frame, American wages have gone up just 26%. So you see, obviously, the tension there, that our deductibles are going up, we're being expected to pay for more health care, but wages aren't rising at the same rate to meet that. And so you get a lot of survey data like this. This is on prescription drug costs that you see 8 in 10 Americans are saying they think their prescription drug costs are unreasonable. If you look at the Affordable Care Act, this is just a survey of marketplace enrollees. You see that the thing people are really frustrated with, the thing at the very bottom that I've circled in red, is their annual deductible. People are actually pretty okay with their choice of hospitals, choice of primary care doctors. It's really that deductible that's driving people a little bit crazy. So, I think these are the two key trends to think about when you think about, well, why are we talking about the health policy issues we're talking about? It's because prices are going up quickly and because rising deductibles mean that we have more exposure to those prices. Enter Medicare for all, single payer, as we've discussed earlier. How you describe it kind of influences how people think about it. I'm going to say Medicare for all, understanding that each of them comes with their own political variance. So I thought it was really notable to see President Barack Obama, saying just recently that calling Medicare for all a good new idea for Democrats to be running on. And I think the reason you're seeing this is because there is still this frustration, even with the Affordable Care Act, with how the healthcare system is working for a lot of Americans. One of the things you're also seeing leading into the 2018 midterms is, a slow gain in support for Medicare for all. I agree with previous speakers that a lot of the polling here is really all over the map at this point. But I think if you kind of aggregate it all together, as the folks at Kaiser Family Foundation have done, and look at the trend over time, you see that we've gone from about 40% of Americans supporting a single government plan, is how it's described in this polling, up to 53% in 2017. Not like an overwhelming majority, but I think it is noticeable to see that 13 percentage point swing in the course of 2 or so decades, that we're moving slowly in that direction. So you're seeing this modest support in single payer in 2017. You're seeing some signs of this being a surprisingly bipartisan issue. This was a poll that Reuters did last month, where they asked people if you'd support a policy of Medicare for all. And one of the things that surprised a lot of people looking at this poll is they ended up finding 52% of Republican voters support a policy of Medicare for all. Now, we'll get into some of the questions about, is this legit? Like, would this actually hold up in elections? I think what I've seen a lot in my reporting is there's a surprising openness on the right among voters to Medicare for all. And, a lot of this is actually informed by reporting that I've done in Eastern Kentucky. So Eastern Kentucky is an area that went overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. Most counties I've spent time in were 80 to 90% Trump voters. It's also an area that's overwhelmingly enrolled in Obamacare. They've seen some of the steepest decreases in their uninsured rate. So I spent time in Eastern Kentucky trying to understand why Obamacare enrollees voted for President Trump, why they supported a candidate who was promising very boldly to take away their health insurance. And I'm not going to get into that reporting, although happy to in questions. But one of the things that came up a lot and surprised me was a number of people on those Obamacare plans saying, why can't we have something like Canada? And again, like, this is an Eastern Kentucky deep red area, and these were people who are on the Affordable Care Act. A lot of them have a deductible upwards of $6,000. They saw other people who earn less money than them get Medicaid, where they don't have a deductible, and they said, I want something like that. I want to be able to go to the doctor, and I don't want to have to pay money. I don't want to be afraid. You know, like one enrollee told me, I'm totally afraid to be sick. I don't have that money to pay up front if I go to the hospital tomorrow. So there is kind of this surprising space where there might be some support among people we traditionally think of as right. I would say you do not see this in Washington yet. It's a very polarized issue in DC, but when you kind of look out at the broad electorate, there might be some space, you know, for this moving into our political conversation. So, and I think this was a really interesting review that Reuters did that I just want to highlight for a moment, is that they found that 2/3 of Democratic nominees right now in 41 battleground districts want to expand the government's role in healthcare. So we're not talking about safe races. We're not talking about someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who supports single payer in New York, where, you know, I'm sure she would get a lot of support for that view. We're talking about people in battleground areas in more Midwestern districts. And about a dozen of those are supporting a Medicare for All platform. So, you know, expanding the government's role in healthcare can mean a lot of things. A lot of those people are supporters of Medicaid expansion, which obviously does not go as far as single payer. But you really are seeing this kind of sweep into the races. So this is a lot. 41 battleground districts is a lot to cover. So when I look forward to kind of to the election in a few weeks, you know, these are some of the candidates I'm going to be watching. I'm really interested in gubernatorial candidates because they actually have the ability to get things done. They are the executive of a state. And if a state, for example, like the one we're in, wants to experiment with a totally different approach to healthcare, they can do that in a way that an individual congressperson couldn't. So I think it's been interesting. You know, these are two single-payer candidates, Andrew Gillum in Florida, Ben Jealous in Maryland, that if they are elected, you know, I'm very curious to see if they try and do something that moves to the left on healthcare, particularly in Florida, which is a state that has not expanded Medicaid, that has had a really conservative approach to healthcare policy. That could be a really interesting combination. Likewise, I'm pretty interested in some battleground candidates. Kara Eastman, the founder of a healthcare nonprofit who's running in Nebraska, Sean Casten in Illinois. I think those are an interesting litmus test of whether Medicare for All can win in these competitive districts, you know, more than seeing it in a district out here in Massachusetts, a district in New York. Are other candidates going to have confidence that they could win on this message, you know, in areas where you typically wouldn't think of this succeeding? So what happens if they win? Not much policy making in Washington, which is kind of the story of the past few years. But I think there will be a lot of policy debate. I think when you have more people interested in these ideas, you start doing some of that debate that we've been talking about how do we expand health insurance? What do we actually mean by single payer? You know, narrowing down those actual policies. You might see state level action, like I mentioned. I think you'll see growth in the new Medicare for All caucus, which was literally just created last year. And you'll see, you know, more of these proposals coming out and being debated if you have more people who support these ideas. And then there's the other question of what happens if they lose. And this is, you know, I put this here because I don't think the Republicans have a very clear vision of what they want to do on healthcare at this point. If I were giving this talk 3 years ago in 2016, you know, leading up to that election, I would say, well, what they want to do is repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. And if they win, they're going to try and repeal Obamacare. You know, they did that. It was not successful. It was a very extended effort that I spent a lot of time covering. And, you know, I could really see it going either way. On the one hand, you have President Trump in December saying that Obamacare is repealed. You know, mission accomplished. We repealed the individual mandate. So we've essentially repealed Obamacare. It actually reminded me when I saw some of the discussions around NAFTA and the harder to pronounce USMCA, which does not lend itself to an acronym very well. It felt very similar in that, you know, what happened were some small tweaks to NAFTA, it got a new name, and President Trump says it's a big, big change. You know, I feel a little bit similarly about how he kind of framed Obamacare repeal. The individual mandate certainly does matter. We're going to learn a little bit more about how much it mattered and what it'll mean to have it repealed. But he kind of declared victory on Obamacare repeal, and a lot of people listened to that. This is from a poll in December that found that 44% of Republican voters think that Donald Trump has repealed Obamacare. So, you know, in one universe, you could see Republicans going forward and saying, you know, this isn't a priority. We've done the political thing that we need to do. We can, you know, just move on to other things. And one other thing I think is important to note is that healthcare just isn't as much of a motivating issue for Republican voters this election cycle. You see Democrats caring a lot more about healthcare than their counterparts on the Republican side. So, that's the case for saying that, maybe healthcare just isn't a big issue for Republicans. But, I think a lot of the folks here who I've talked to for the past decade covering the Affordable Care Act know that it's really, really hard for Republicans to quit Obamacare repeal. They just can't stop. So you see things, Vice President Pence saying we'll continue. You see Senator Dean Heller, who waffled through this whole process, saying if we get 53, 54 seats, we can repeal and replace and change the Affordable Care Act as we know it today. So where does this go? I honestly don't have a great sense of, what they do on repeal. I say, if I were, I'm not a betting woman in this space. If I were, I would bet they try repeal again because that's what they've been doing for so long and it seems very hard to get away from. But it feels like a bit of a toss-up to me. So that's what's happening in Washington. But I think one other thing in 2018 that's going to be really key, that's been mentioned a little bit, are these Medicaid expansion ballot initiatives. So Idaho, Utah, and Nebraska voters will all see ballots in a month to expand Medicaid. They're the 3 states in light blue there, and they're among this among these, about less than half at this point, among the 17 states that have not adopted Medicaid expansion at this point. This is the second year that we're going to see Medicaid ballot initiatives. The first one passed in Maine last year, and I'll talk a little bit more about what's going on with Maine's ballot right now. But I think this is, an interesting test of in these states that have been really recalcitrant to moving forward on Medicaid expansion, can ballot initiatives be a political tool to move that policy forward? And just to give you a sense of kind of what this would mean, and I will say the numbers vary a lot depending on where you're getting them. I'm getting mine from Kaiser Family Foundation. They estimate if all 3 of these pass, we're talking about 168,000 low-income Americans gaining health insurance coverage. So that's a lot of people. And that's, a population, as Dr. Summers was mentioning, that really, is most at risk, is likely uninsured at this point. And, you can think about all the findings he talked about what it would mean for those people to gain access. One of the things I think is really interesting about Medicaid ballot initiative is that it's pretty popular, even in red states. So the places that haven't expanded Medicaid at this point nearly all have more conservative leadership. You look at the Deep South, you look at stretches in the Midwest, and generally Obamacare is not very popular in those places. However, when you pull on Medicaid expansion, you get some pretty positive results. This is from the Salt Lake Tribune, which is polling on Utah's initiative to expand Medicaid. They find 54% support, so a majority. And I thought it was interesting, they find 52% support among people who describe themselves as somewhat conservative. So Medicaid expansion, I think, during the Obama administration was kind of part and parcel of the Affordable Care Act. But now that President Obama is out of office, we're a few years away from that, you kind of see more of an acceptance of the idea of Medicaid expansion. I think there's another even more interesting poll from Idaho on this, where they ask people, there are these uninsured Idahoans, would you favor or oppose taking action to provide them with health care? And they find from a Boise State University poll that 75% favor. I will say if you ask this question differently, would you support it if it required more state revenue? It might be a lower number, but I think that's a big, big number, especially when you consider that in the same poll, if you ask people if they approve of Obamacare, you get a 35% approval rating. So you can see Medicaid expansion in Idaho has become a really separate issue from the Affordable Care Act. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic that's just developing, and people who support Medicaid advantage or expansion are taking advantage of that and trying to rally people in support of these. Is Maine a preview? So as anyone who's been keeping up with their Medicaid news knows, Maine has expanded Medicaid by ballot initiative nearly a year ago, and yet the expansion has not gone through. Governor Paul LePage has refused to follow a ballot initiative expanding Medicaid. He has been court ordered to do so, yet it hasn't happened. And it seems at this point like it's just going to hinge on the results of their gubernatorial election in November, where you do have the Republican candidate who says, I will keep refusing this. You have a Democratic candidate saying, I will implement Medicaid expansion immediately. One question I get asked a lot is, well, are other states just looking at Maine and saying, like, well, why bother doing a ballot initiative if it seems like it's going to be meaningless? The answer I've generally gotten is no. The most at least two of the three governors in those ballot states have said that they plan to respect the will of the people, that if people vote to expand Medicaid, even if they do not personally support it, they support the ballot initiative process. So I don't really see, I don't see Medicaid expansion campaigners getting scared off by what's going on in Maine. It seems like they are looking at this as a key tool to expand Medicaid expansion in places where the state leadership is, hostile to that idea. What happens if they pass? I think the obvious big one is a lot of low-income Americans gain coverage, and they get all those benefits that have been talked about earlier. You'd probably see more states turn to ballot initiatives. We'd still have 14 states left that have not expanded Medicaid, including, the biggest holdouts, Florida and Texas, where if you expanded Medicaid in those two states, pretty sizable dent in our uninsured population. So I think if you see these be successful, you'll start seeing more of them in upcoming ballots. Last but not least, looking forward to 2020 and circling back to kind of a little bit of where we started and some themes we've been talking about today, is that I think we are entering into this really intense, probably politically heated debate around Medicare for all. I think it is really notable that photograph that was shown earlier of all these Democrats standing behind Bernie Sanders as he introduces his single payer proposal. If you look back at the 2008 election, John Edwards, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, you didn't see anyone running on single payer. Now it seems pretty guaranteed that whoever runs as a Democrat will be running on this single payer platform. So I think you see the politics moving in this direction pretty quickly, but some of the policy work that still needs to be done, and that probably will be done, is these different candidates assemble up their policy shops and start thinking about, okay, how is our proposal going to look different from the other guy's proposal? What is Bernie Sanders' version of single payer versus Kristen Gillibrand's version of single payer? And I think one of the things all this is going to face is just a divide we still have in the United States around healthcare and who deserves healthcare. So I think this is a really important chart to keep in mind as we get into this debate around a universal healthcare coverage system. This is polling that Gallup has done back through the past 20 or so years, asking, do you think it is the responsibility of the federal government to make sure all Americans have healthcare? And I think what's notable here isn't the variation, it's the fact that we are incredibly divided on this question. It goes up and down, you see different majorities and different swings, but you see that we do not agree on this. And this is not true of a lot of our peer countries. About a year ago, I actually went with Senator Sanders on a reporting trip to Toronto. He was doing kind of a listening tour of Canadian healthcare. And there are two things that stood out to me on that tour. One is Bernie Sanders is a huge rock star in Toronto and could not go anywhere without getting recognized, which was the flight attendant who saw him coming off the plane in Toronto was just so starstruck, and he was taking selfies everywhere. That's a bit of an aside. The other thing is this thing Senator Sanders said to me after we completed this. He said, what he thought, I asked him, what did you learn on this tour of Canada? You obviously know a lot about single payer already. He said it was interesting to talk to patients who said, we believe healthcare is a right. And if you walked out on the street and talked to people, they would find it inconceivable that somebody not be able to get healthcare they need because they don't have the money. And I think he pegs the Canadian healthcare system totally right. That it would just be unimaginable to have someone not get healthcare because they couldn't afford it, to even ask someone to pay for healthcare. The Canadian system is really unique in not having cost sharing. And it really is an affront to the egalitarian nature of the Canadian healthcare system. And I say this as someone who's actually a dual citizen and lived in Canada when I was a kid, that I think Canadians are fine with those lines as long as everyone has to wait in that same line. I don't think we're at this consensus yet in the United States. I think we have a deep, deep divide among who deserves healthcare and who doesn't. I think a lot of that traces back to the structure of American healthcare, that we for decades have had a system that tethers your insurance status to your work status. So insurance has come to be seen, in a lot of places as something you get because you work. It's a reward, it's not a right. And I think in a lot of the work requirements you're seeing come up right now, you see that ethos taking hold. So I think we still have this debate to be had. There are a lot of other debates to be had about what does Medicare for all cover. You can see a system that's really generous in its benefits, one that's a little bit skimpier. It seems like the consensus is Medicare for all needs to cover more than what Medicare covers today. How do we pay for it? Huge debate, and I think this is one of the places where in covering Medicare for All proposals historically have seen things get hung up. I spent a decent amount of time in Vermont in 2014 when they were working on single payer. And the place, Vermont was a place where they had a lot of agreement around these questions, that it's a traditionally liberal state. There did seem to be agreement about the right to health care, but the place where that fell apart was when they actually had to pay for it. And they realized they would need, I believe it was an 11.5% payroll tax increase, a 9.5% income tax increase. It would cost $2.5 billion to pull off the Vermont single payer effort, and they abandoned it. They, really wanted single payer. They got caught up in that financing. I think there's a question of, does our system look more like Canada's or like Germany's? And we've talked a little bit about some international systems already, but do we want a system that, like the Canadian system, prizes egalitarianism, puts everyone in the same line? Or do we want more of a German or Swiss system that has competing health insurance plans that are regulated? And do Democrats agree on what happens next? I think one of the things I could see happening is, even with Democrats in control of Congress, you could see something similar to what happens with Republicans, where there were a lot of different ideas on repeal, particularly on how to deal with Medicaid expansion. And the caucus was split. They ultimately couldn't pass anything because they didn't really agree on where to go next. You already have some competing proposals in the Senate. We've talked a little bit about Senator Sanders' Medicare for All bill. Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut has a Medicare buy-in bill, essentially a public option. Senator Brian Schatz has a Medicaid buy-in bill, which is kind of a new idea we've seen in Washington over the past few years. Most of the public options that we've seen discussed that let people buy a government plan tend to be Medicare. I think this actually started in Nevada, where one enterprising legislator said, well, on the state level, why not just do Medicaid? And delightfully, I've gotten to know that state legislator. His last name is Sprinkle, and it came to be known as Sprinkle Care in Nevada, which is it's a very nice name. But you've actually seen that idea getting a little bit of traction in Washington, mostly because Medicaid reimbursement rates are lower. Therefore, it'd be less expensive to let people buy into Medicaid. Would likely have more opposition from hospitals, from providers who would get those lower reimbursement rates. But we already have this set of competing proposals. And I think when I look forward to 2020, I kind of expect to see a robust policy debate around this. On the other side, what about the Republicans? In 2016, again, I think the plan was sort of clear. It was clear in the sense that Republicans wanted to repeal and replace Obamacare. It was not clear on how they got there, and I think that was ultimately their downfall. In 2020, I don't really see much of a proactive policy-making agenda from the Republicans. Instead, I really expect them to be on defense, on offense, attacking Medicare for All proposals. And we actually just saw yesterday the NRCC, the National Republican Campaign Committee, putting out an ad attacking Medicare for All that featured this woman. She has a sick kid on the couch. She's calling, saying, I want to see my doctor. And the person on the other side of the phone is saying, sorry, you can't see this doctor anymore, not since Democrats passed Medicare for All. So you're already, which seems like a somewhat implausible situation, but that's neither here nor there. So you're already seeing those attack ads come up. And one of the things I think is really key to understand about this particular issue is the public's opinion is really fungible right now. This was kind of a clever poll that the Kaiser Family Foundation did, where they asked people, do you oppose or support having a national health care plan? And then they said, well, what if an opponent told you this thing or that thing about the plan? And you see these huge 20% swings in public opinion. So while you see, at the beginning, there's a general openness to this issue politically, people haven't really made up their minds, and their positions are very easily swayed. And I would say it's true on the other side, too. If you give them positive arguments, people are, swayable in a positive direction. So I think, politically, there's a lot of people who are going to want to sway public opinion on this issue. So I think that is all I have. I have one more slide. The one thing we know for sure is the healthcare debate is not ending. That us healthcare journalists are going to be very gainfully employed for the next few years covering all of this, and that there will be a lot to talk about going forward. So thank you all so much for your time. I appreciate it.
I'm going to ask Sarah one question, and we get her on the panel too. So you're in the communication business, in addition to being a self-described policy nerd. What communication advice would you give to people who want to expand coverage? I mean, it sometimes feels, I think, for those of us who work on this, that we always lose the communication war. And I think some of the data that you showed. So what have you learned from being on the ground about what we're doing poorly and need to do better?
Yeah, so I think, in another version of this question I've gotten is, what did the Obama administration do wrong in communicating the Affordable Care Act? Why couldn't they make it more popular? I think one of the challenges that any change to the healthcare system faces is people feel very strongly about their healthcare, and people feel very, very strongly about changes to their healthcare. I remember in 2013, I believe it was, covering a wave of cancellation notices that were created by the Affordable Care Act, outlawing some of these skimpier products that would no longer be allowed under the market. And the Obama administration, it framed this as, look, you're all getting an upgrade. And, a lot of people did not see it that way. They said, no, I'm getting a price increase and I want my skimpy, less expensive plan. Why is it being outlawed? So I think the challenge, in communicating around any healthcare change is that change is really difficult. And, I think you see this in a lot of different polling data around Congress, around healthcare plans. People are angry at the system writ large, but like their own individual thing. People are angry at Congress, but tend to have higher rankings of their own individual congressperson. So I think I would say that is the challenge that anyone who wants to change the healthcare system is up against. In terms of how to do it better, I'm a little since I cover these issues, I'm reticent to give advice on here's how single payer supporters should deliver their message, since I'm one of the people covering those messages. So I think I will probably end my answer there. That's probably less instructive, but just on why it is so hard to kind of push change with the American healthcare system.
I thought I can trap you, but you're too clever. So anyway, thank you. Join me in thanking Sarah.